Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's free ACEC-BC Lunch and Learn. My name is Caroline Andrews. I'm the President and CEO of the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies, British Columbia. We're meeting today in more than 100 separate locations. To unify us, we'd like to acknowledge that ACEC-BC is based in the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and in particular, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We continue to include this acknowledgement in our virtual events as an opportunity for us to think a little bit more about the people and the communities whose lives are impacted by the work of consulting engineering companies every day. ACEC-BC represents 9,500 people working in more than 80 companies across the province. Our association's purpose is to serve the interests of members through advocacy, creating opportunity for collaboration, and building profile for members and the industry. As we proceed through the BC Restart Plan, we're working together to support consulting engineering companies. And while we miss meeting in person, we are continuing to search for opportunities to build connections between members, clients, and partners at events like this through our online resources and through ACEC-BC's many committees and networks. All of our association operations, including events, have shifted to the virtual environment so that we can continue to support your practice as you work from home and as you transition back to the office. Over the past few months, we've hosted a series of free webinars, some of which you can find on our website. Next week will be our last event for the June period, hosting our first virtual client mixer with Metro Vancouver. Chief Administrative Officer Jerry Dobrovolny will be providing an overview of the regional district's plans to support drinking water, wastewater treatment, and solid waste management. Mr. Dobrovolny will be joined by members of his leadership team for an interactive session, including an extensive Q&A with event participants. In the following weeks, our young professional group will begin offering some free virtual events, including a guide to starting a young professionals group in your organization, and career advancement while working remotely. For advance notice of our webinars, please join our email list through the website acec-bc.ca. We invite you to stay up to date by visiting the ACEC-BC COVID-19 Resource Center on our website. There you'll find regular updates, relevant industry content, and information from our partner network. You can connect with us through the feedback portal to provide us with your perspective on how your organization is managing and how we can help. Today, we welcome Mark Liedemann from Partnerships BC to discuss the competitive alliance contracting model. Following the presentation, there will be time for questions from participants. Mark's being very generous with his time today. To ask a question at any time, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom app. So down at the bottom, click on the Q&A button and enter your question as it comes to you. With Mark's agreement, we are recording this webinar and a copy will be emailed to you after the event. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mark Liedemann, President and CEO, Partnerships BC. Mark joined the PBC executive team in 2016 and took on the role of President and CEO in December 2018. In this role, Mark leads the management team responsible for planning, procurement, and implementation of large and complex infrastructure projects in BC and throughout Canada. Key responsibilities include corporate strategy as well as shareholder and stakeholder relations. Please join me in welcoming Mark.
Thank you, Carolyn. Nice to be back and talk to you and to your members. I think it'll be easiest, as you suggest, that we kind of do questions at the end. We would encourage questions on alliance contracts. If there are kind of other issues that are of interest to members that would like to ask in general about Partnerships BC's activities or projects that we're working on, happy to take those too at the end. So alliance contracts, we'll go through here and a bit of information. But before we get to the alliance contracts, just a bit of an agenda. Talk a little bit about Partnerships BC in terms of our activities. And I'll talk a little bit about projects that are underway and projects that are probably coming to market soon. I'll talk a little more specifically about the alliance contracts, how they're structured, a little bit how they work, and when we might consider using alliance contracts here in British Columbia. In terms of who we are, we've been around for 18 years, so we're not new, though some of our activities are, I think, evolving over time. We really are the center of expertise for government with regards to, as Carolyn said, planning, procuring, and implementing complex infrastructure projects. And over the years, we've worked with probably many of your members on different projects. We work in different sectors. Healthcare, transportation, and accommodation would be our main one for sure. We are a little kind of private consulting company firm. We don't receive any core government funding. We act on a fee-for-service basis. Every time we do work for somebody in government, we need to set up a contract. We bill them monthly for the hours that we work, and that's how we fund ourselves. Well, we primarily do work for the province of BC. One of our requirements is that we are self-sufficient from a financial point of view. So right now we're kind of exclusively working for the province of BC, very busy here. But in previous years, sometimes the capital plan ebbs and wanes in BC, and our activity ebbs and wanes with that. So then we go and seek work outside of the jurisdiction. We're doing a little bit of work right now in Nunavut, where we've done a couple of projects in the past, and that actually kind of reflects with my virtual background. I'm not broadcasting today from the Iqaluit Airport, which is a project that I worked on for many years in the past, but we continue to have a relationship with the government of Nunavut and help them on various projects. And we've worked for the federal government, various municipalities, and other provinces as well. And in addition to actually doing the project work, we also want to continue to engage with stakeholders like ACEC and others to understand what your challenges are and how we can actually improve your relationship with us and on the projects that you bid and participate on. So, as I said before, our key aspects are project planning and procurement, and then a little bit on implementation. We don't do as much work on the implementation as we do on the project planning and procurement. Those are definitely the mainstays for us. But sometimes after the contracts are executed, a dispute or a disagreement happens about various contractual clauses, and sometimes we come back and we try to work and broker a solution between the contractor and the public sector owner. In terms of the sectors, we're kind of in a lot of different sectors. The projects in transportation tend to be the biggest by construction value, but by the number of projects, health would by far be the largest. In our 18 years, we've done about close to 60 projects. Most of those, well, maybe about, well, a large portion, maybe up to about 35 of those, I think actually are just design build projects. Well, notwithstanding our name, Partnerships BC, most people do associate us exclusively with public-private partnerships, kind of the long-term 30-year contracts. And while we have done dozens of those, we actually do a lot of just design build projects. We're doing some construction management projects actually right now as well. We're doing some progressive design build projects, which we came and talked about a couple of weeks ago at ACEC. And we're also looking at things like alliance contracting. So that's why I'm here today. So these are kind of record times for us at PBC in terms of active projects. We currently have 10 active projects that are in procurement at various stages. So that is keeping us very busy. We're kind of actively seeking additional colleagues that like to join us and help us. Because in addition to the projects that are in procurement, we have a lot of projects that we've procured recently, which are under construction here on the right-hand side. And we have still involvement in various aspects of those that tend to be more limited. But in addition to the 10 that are listed on the left-hand side in terms of active procurement, we have 4 or 5 new ones which are likely coming. So ones that have been worked on in the planning stages for quite some time would be the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, Cowichan District Hospital, Cowichan Secondary School, Surrey Langley SkyTrain, and the Dawson Creek Hospital, which is a new build hospital. So our workload is only going to increase, and we are doing planning on yet other projects which are in the earlier stages and probably aren't likely to come to market in the near future, but will be coming in the longer to medium term. So in terms of history, this is too long for me to read out, but I'll ask you to take a minute here to read this quote about contracting. Obviously, a bit of a historical perspective. I'll give you a couple minutes to read that. I actually have a question for you. So my question for you is when is this quote from? So I'd ask you, we're going to try an interactive aspect here with Zoom. So give you a hint, it's definitely not from the 2000s. So some of these challenges might exist today, and they do. I'd ask you to maybe just submit your quote or what your vote is for the quote, and get a sense of when people think this is from. And then once Ben is helping us on the technology side, it kind of shows the result, then I'll let you know when this is from and from whom. Then I'll have to let you know. You'll have to let me know when people respond. Okay, there we go. See the results on the page. So most people think it's from the 1800s. Good guess. I will say that very few of you are correct based on your answers. So there. So this is actually from 1685, from Louis XIV's chief fortification builder. So this challenge of procuring and getting things built is an age-old problem. And while there are different ways to potentially solve it, one of the things that we'll talk about is alliance contracting, and can that potentially help with this challenge. So moving away from the older history, moving maybe to more modern history. In the modern world, project alliancing is really stemming from the oil and gas sector. In the 1990s, British Petroleum used this in a project called Project Andrew in the North Sea. They had a well which they wanted to drill, but they couldn't drill it. If they used the traditional approach with the traditional cost and outcome, the well wouldn't be economical. They needed to find a way to make this particular well economical, and they took this approach, which now we commonly call alliance contracting. When we think about a 450 million pound contract in the 1990s, that's a mega project by any standard. And maybe it shouldn't be surprising to us that alliance contracting comes out of the oil and gas sector, which historically has been, probably at least the last 100 years, among the biggest capital spenders on the planet. So it was a very successful project for British Petroleum. There's a couple of key factors there, which kind of the ability to prevent litigation among the different people that were involved with delivering the project. They also had a sharing of risks between all the parties. And they also had a series of kind of key performance indicators with consequences and opportunities for gain for parties that were part of the contract. And they really didn't focus on price as their key criteria for determining who would be part of the project. So moving from kind of the North Sea and British Petroleum, looking today, the alliance contracts are in widespread use in Australia and New Zealand, and I think somewhat to a lesser degree in the UK. They're predominantly used on large civil projects. Think about transportation, water treatment plants, that type of thing. Kind of in my research to better understand alliance contracts, I went back into the history books in BC and found out that we've actually done 2 of these projects in the past. It's really before Partnerships BC was fully up and running, I would say, in the early 2000s. One was a road up by Prince Rupert called the Kincolith Road, and the other one was a very small section of the Sea to Sky Highway where they tested out some technology associated with retaining walls and the like, which was in advance of the larger P3 procurement that happened before the 2010 Olympics. But overall, while there are a few alliance contracts in Canada, they're relatively rare. Infrastructure Ontario is actually running one procurement right now for an alliance model associated with Union Station. I don't know too much about it, but I understand that they've tried to procure it twice in the past, more on a traditional basis, and haven't been unable to complete the procurement. So they're trying it now with this alliance model. And kind of as part of this investigation, and a lot of the slides that I'm going to talk about in the future, they're really based on a trip that I did with some of my colleagues to do a deep dive into alliance contracts. And we went to Australia and New Zealand kind of at the beginning of the year. Fortunately for us, it was right before COVID hit, and we were blissfully unaware at the time. So we were able to go to Australia and New Zealand and spend a lot of time with public sector agencies, sometimes contractors and advisors as well. But we got a much better appreciation for the model in terms of how they use it and when they use it. So spend a little bit of time on this slide, and this is potentially the most important slide of the entire presentation. When we start talking about the alliance model, I think the first thing we need to consider and think about is that in contrast to a traditional project would have 2 signatories, whether we talk about a design bid build project or a design build project or even a DBFM project. All of those have 2 counterparties that sign the contract, the owner of some kind, and then we have some private sector entity. And in those contracts, risks tend to be very well defined. Lawyers help us do that, and technical teams help us do that, define risks into kind of different buckets. And they're normally laid out with quite a level of certainty in the contract. And it's kind of very much us and them in the contract. So alliance contracts take a fundamentally different approach and really turn almost everything that we think about traditional contracts on its head. And it's a bit of a mind-bending exercise. So the first issue is that these are actually multi-party contracts. So we think about a project that is in procurement right now. Let's take the Broadway subway project, not an alliance model, but we just think about that. We'd have the province as the public sector counterparty. Then we would have the, in this case, there's a couple of joint ventures that are bidding. The joint venture partners would sign the alliance contract separately. The design firms would sign the alliance contract separately. If there was a major, say, tunneling subcontractor associated with the project, that tunneling subcontractor would sign separately as an alliance party. So you might have 5 or 6 people signing your alliance contract right off the get-go. So it's a multi-party contract as opposed to a 2-party contract. And that starts to permeate everything in the entire agreement. So in terms of how the projects are managed, there is a kind of a joint management structure. So there's really no us and them. There's just only us in the alliance contract. So everything is managed jointly. So this would be managed jointly by all those participants that sign the contract, as well as the public sector who would be a signatory to the contract. They all need to work together for the best of the project, And that starts by actually having the best person for the role. Some of the roles will be filled by the public sector, some will be filled by the private sector. And it's not based on kind of what level of people's financial interest is in the project. It's actually based on a best for project. So once you hire the best people into your team, then you need to make collective use of their experience to meet the objectives of the owner as stated for the project in question. And then again, you have a joint decision-making approach. You need to have a unanimous approach to decision-making. You don't get to outvote other people. You need to come to a consensus, which can be challenging. And going back to the quote here, when we start to talk about the equitable approach, the fundamental underpinning of this is kind of good faith and integrity. I'd argue that on many of the projects that I see that run into problems, and that's quite a few of them at some point, the good faith and integrity component doesn't always exist. So this is an attempt to try to go back with the alliance model, to go back, as per that quote, go back to a good faith and integrity approach to contracting. And we'll talk a little more about payment in a minute, but from a transparency perspective, these really are open book type transactions. So the public sector as the ultimate paymaster here on public projects would have complete access for audits, and it would be an open book process. Tightly related to good faith and integrity is kind of the concept of no fault, no blame. So an alliance contract as structured, say in Australia, New Zealand, would have no litigation clauses. You can't sue the other party. So you can't have claims in an alliance model. It's counterintuitive. So it's tightly linked to the good faith. Yes, there might be a mistake or an error that happened. The focus on those when they happen is to mitigate them and deal with them and move forward, not sit there and lay blame and sue anybody. Since it's all us and it's not the two parties, us and them, there's nobody to sue. You're all part of the same entity. So the idea is to kind of focus some of that effort on claims and litigation approach into actually making that go into the project and kind of have the best outcome possible. One of the ways that happens is through a different financial mechanism than what would be in a traditional design build or design to build approach. So we have a pain share, gain share mechanism where the risks and responsibilities are shared between all the parties that sign the contract. We don't have an allocation of risk saying this is your risk and this is my risk, all our risk in the alliance model. And then therefore the sharing of the risks and rewards are also shared between the parties equally. I'll come back to that in a minute with a couple of slides in terms of how that works. So this is a bit of this is a sample org chart from a project in Auckland. Spent some time there with the New Zealand Transportation Authority. So in this particular case, it was a road project. There was public sector represented by NZTA, New Zealand Transportation Authority. And then their project alliance board was had these 6 individuals on them. It was a joint venture with 2 contractors, and then the design firms were also in a joint venture arrangement for this, and that was Opus and Jacobs. The contractors were Fulton Hogan and Heb. So this is a group that would need to make all the decisions and come to a consensus basis and provide leadership for the overall project. Below that, you would have something called an alliance leadership team. In this case, the leader of the alliance leadership team was somebody named Gavin Hendrick. And then they had indicated where all these different people would come from. Some of these people in the boxes in the bottom row, they would actually come from public sector, and some would come from Fulton Hogan or Heb or Opus or Jacobs, and others would just be contractors because they decided an external third-party contractor would be the best person to actually fulfill the role better than people within the respective agencies that were members of the Project Alliance board. And I think one of the key roles is obviously culture needs to be very different in this type of a contract. And if people are not kind of fitting in, it really becomes a responsibility ultimately of the Project Alliance Board to kick people off the island and to bring somebody new onto the island. We heard a lot about that when we were in New Zealand and Australia, is that people are actually what make the alliance model work, not the contractual clauses. So getting the right people is super important to success the project. In terms of, this is from the same project, kind of roles and responsibilities. And as soon as you go down to Australia and New Zealand, you realize they got slightly different language for everything. Not only do they drive on the wrong side of the road, but you have to deal with all these terms. So couldn't avoid them all. But they definitely have the concept of what's called owner participants, what they call OPs, and then they have the non-owner participant being the NOPs. But ultimately, the risk and reward responsibilities are distributed 50-50 between the public sector and the private sector. The private sector can organize themselves any way they like, and different teams will organize themselves differently. In this particular case, Fulton Hogan and HEB were in a 60-40 joint venture. They were going to take 40% of the gains and 40% of the losses. And then the two design firms were each in for 5% of the losses and the gains. And then you can see that each one obviously has areas of expertise, which they are going to contribute to the success of the overall alliance. So getting back to payment mechanism, always something close to my heart, being a former banker, how people get paid. And if you're a lender, how lenders get repaid. I will say that there aren't any lending arrangements in an alliance model. Lenders don't exist. But we think about it, these are kind of a target cost type contract. And we'll talk a little bit more about the procurement process, about how you end up with your preferred proponent. But from this perspective here, once you have a contract and you have a target project cost, there's really these three components. You have the reimbursable cost, the corporate overheads, and the profit. So as you move through the project, you're either going to achieve your actual cost, in which case, if actual cost equals the project projected cost, then everyone gets out what they expected. People get their profit, they get their corporate overheads, and obviously reimbursable costs are paid. If there's a cost overrun, because it costs more than expected, because bad things or unexpected things happen, then what starts to happen is that that cost overrun is shared 50-50 between the public sector and the private sector as a group. And then the private sector starts to contribute kind of 50 cents for every dollar of overage, up until the point where they're exhausted their margin, as shown on this particular slide. Reimbursable costs are always reimbursed in full. Same thing happens in the opposite direction. If there's a gain and the project is able to deliver more for less cost than the estimated project cost, then that also is shared 50-50 between the two parties. And then in that case, the margin here would increase according to this particular slide. In addition to kind of, that's on a straight cost basis, the alliance contracts also tend to have a, I guess, call it maybe an incentive pool for components that are not directly related to cost. So this is one that I kind of took from a rail overpass, underpass program in Melbourne. So they had a pool of money which was available for the contractor to earn money or lose money on, based on whether they met predetermined outcomes in these 5 areas. You can see none of these kind of directly relate to cost, but they are interested in safety, environment, disruption, stakeholder and community, and schedule. And they had this one particular program in Melbourne was very large. They were looking at dozens and dozens of these road rail spaces and how to remove them. And they had, I think, about 5 separate alliances going. It was an $18 billion program. It was enormous. And so this is for an individual project level, this particular slide, these KPIs, but they also had some which are actually at the program level, which dealt with the alliance that might be looking after 5 or 6 of these road, rail, overpass, underpass situations. And there they had other things to do with, you know, things like apprentices hired, local content type issues. Those kind of things were dealt with more at a slightly different level, also with a target pool available for contractors to earn or not earn money off. So this kind of summarizes, I think, a lot of what I've already talked about. This is from the National Alliance Contracting Guidelines in Australia, who has actually excellent guidance on their website. I've spent a lot of time reading and talking to others about. But it kind of, you know, starts on the inside in. Starts with the owner needs to define what's their value for money statement, and then really look at what's the project solution. You need the team to deliver the solution. You need to know what your target cost is. It's kind of another acronym they use a lot in Australia and New Zealand called the TALK. And then there's actually the commercial arrangement, which is the contract that knits those things together. And then as you start to move further out into this wheel, then you get into a lot of those types of things that I talked about on one of my previous slides, whether it's good faith and integrity, the sharing of risk, transparency, and those things. They're kind of on the outer circle of this wheel. But this is very similar to information that I've presented before, just graphically appealing, I found. So another interesting question, which we need to ask ourselves and be able to provide guidance to province of BC is, when would you actually use one of these alliance contracts? They sound great, but they definitely have a different risk profile for government. And I think they have had challenges in New Zealand and Australia, and sometimes overuse of the alliance contracts. So they actually are pretty strict in terms of now when they actually choose to use the alliance. So the first one is, you know, can they define upfront if it's difficult to define when the changes will occur, I think the most important ones for me are actually number 2 and 3 here, and that's to do with kind of risk quantification. If you can't adequately define and measure it, and or sometimes you want to do it for very quick issues, and sometimes, you know, we talked about that in New Zealand with the Christchurch earthquake recovery project. They needed to get on with it right away. For some applications, that can work quite well. And then sometimes the owner has very specific knowledge which they can bring to bear for the success of the project. And this can be a good way to combine the expertise of the public sector and the private sector. And lastly, on some stakeholder issues. It was interesting when we went to New Zealand and Australia and we talked to people, they often asked, what projects are you considering using alliance contracts for? And they always came back to this list. If we couldn't pass things on this list, they said, nope, don't do this. Go to a different form of contract. It's quite interesting. So moving on to procurement. How do you get to getting an alliance contract at the end of the day? Again, they have very different types of lingo for procurement in New Zealand and Australia. So I've tried to convert this to how we would most likely procure it in British Columbia using terms we are more familiar with. We would probably still go with a 2-stage process, an RFQ and an RFP. Starting with the RFQ, we would, there'd be some obviously mandatory financial requirements, capacity, insurance, those types of things. But in terms of how you would determine who would be moving forward, we'd really be probably looking at 4 key aspects. Experience, kind of corporately, then there's going to be the actual key individuals that are going to come forward, culture and philosophy, and whether they're willing to move forward into the proposed legal agreement frameworks for the alliance contract. Unlike what we have in a traditional design build or design build finance type projects, we would normally shortlist to 3. In this arrangement, we would only shortlist to 2. And then we would take those forward to the RFP phase. So moving on to the RFP phase, there'll be a lot of similarities to an existing design build or design build finance process. It's a collaborative, interactive process. You definitely have a fairness advisor involved in the project to keep an eye on things. You would have these collaborative meetings where they advance their design, and at some point they will make their submission and they will give you this target project cost, or what they would call a talk down there. You would give them obviously information about the technical aspects of their project solution, and then there's a renewed evaluation of the key individuals. And actually during the RFP period, there's normally a series of workshops between the owner and the contractor, which are almost like role playing, where the owner will be evaluating the approach and response of the key individuals to various situations, which will factor into the RFP evaluation. And unlike the way many of our current projects are, I think, heavily weighted to a low cost evaluation, these ones are not emphasis on low cost. Cost is still one of the elements, but it becomes much more important to evaluate the key individuals. If you don't have the right individuals, there's no way that your alliance model can be successful. And I think compared to what we've seen historically from an average here in British Columbia, I think the level of partial compensation or the stipend would be higher than what we've seen in the past. So I think that was my end of the scheduled one, but I'm happy to take a series of questions, and I'll leave this up because depending on the question, I might go back to various slides to depending on what it says.
Thanks, Mark. There are a number of questions. The first one really is around what sector you see using Alliance for first in British Columbia. So Jamie has asked, do we see this model being used for healthcare in the future?
So that's a good question. So one of the things I didn't mention in my comments is that right now on BC Bid, Partnerships BC has posted an RFP for transaction advisory services for an alliance model. So in there, we are looking for people with experience with using the alliance model, and to help us kind of put together our, I guess, commercial framework for the province in terms of how we would proceed to implement this. I presented this at a relatively high level, but there are more details that need to be worked out, obviously, before we commence on a procurement. That document does indicate that we are looking to do a pilot project, and that pilot project will most likely be in the vertical infrastructure space. But I'm not in a position at the moment where I can actually announce what that project is. But we're looking as an initial pilot as a vertical project as opposed to a transportation project.
Thanks, Mark. Andy had sort of an expanded version of that question, which I think you've covered the first half on, but the second half of this question was whether you felt that with things like the introduction of different kinds of project delivery models, does that indicate that there's appetite within government to accept different risk profiles?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as part of my orientation for government, I've spent time with senior decision makers in government, giving them a version of this presentation as well so that they really understand the characteristics of it. And that presentation went into a little more detail actually on the differences in risk allocation, and I'd say certainty about schedule and price outcomes between different contract models. We think about we'd say that the highest outcome of risk transfer and price certainty probably happens with the DBFMs I would argue. There's a lot of risk transfer in those contracts, and they're kind of backed up by private finance with normally significant financial consequences for failure to meet. Whereas an alliance model is very different. And I think government would need to understand that there's different outcomes. It's not that they can't be good. There's just a risk profile which is different. And government needs to accept that there is, that they are holding or sharing more risk with the private partner associated with that, more than with a traditional contract, probably any kind. So I think that's important, and I think government does understand that. But it goes back to the previous slide, which was, when should you use it? And if you don't have risks that are difficult for the private sector to price, or if risks can be managed and priced effectively, then it doesn't really make sense to do the risk sharing approach. Then you're better off going for certainty with more of a fixed price, fixed schedule contract of multiple kinds. You could do that. It's where you really have a risk where it can't adequately be priced, or people would have to price so high that the risk premium isn't worthwhile for government. Then you may want to consider an alliance model. It goes back to those, I think there were 6 bullets on that page about when you would use it. I can go back.
So sort of to follow that thread along, Brian was asking a question about application of portions of the model. So we've seen this as well in some of the conversations we're having about procurement for things like municipal engineering and things like that. We advocate for qualification-based selection, but recognizing that that's a significant change in the way that many of the clients do business, there are pieces of that that will get us further along the road towards a sort of a better relationship. Do you see that there are elements from the alliance model that might be able to be borrowed over and applied in DBF procurement?
It's challenging just because the contract models are so fundamentally different. DBF is another one that has quite well-defined, it's either your risk or my risk. Some things are shared, but the sharing is normally not the big bucket. The bucket is either it's my risk or your risk. So I think that becomes more problematic, where I think we maybe see maybe a little more of this is actually more in the progressive DB, Carolyn. And, in the progressive DB, we're doing in Stewart Lake and Cowichan, these healthcare projects, there's going to be a much bigger emphasis on key individuals. Because we're really going down to one party with little or no price competition to move forward, and then work with the one party collaboratively, help them get to the design, and then look to get a price that we can determine is value for the public sector. That has actually a lot to do with who you retain as a public sector, who you contract with, and who those people that are coming to the party with. So that's where I think it's a little easier to have more of a qualifications-based approach and focus on people. It's harder to DBF where the risks are more well-defined, and traditionally the DBF is more of a competitive situation where you have multiple people competing. We've been less focused on, we do ask for key individuals, but they're not weighted as heavily as in a progressive DB arrangement.
So I think, again, sort of building on that, this is helpful, I think, for people to understand the differences between the models, because there is always some things that are the same and some things that are quite different. Brett had a question, I think, that you just actually answered, which is around the progressive model, which is that the outline you provided, he's described as the competitive alliance with 2 shortlisted teams. And are there examples where the alliance team is selected primarily on qualifications and possibly unit cost rates without a second step RFP of cost price criteria in selecting the team? Could you expand further on this and whether this would be considered in BC?
Yeah, okay. So that's a good question as well. So when you start to get into kind of these types of alliance policy issues in New Zealand and Australia, they have 2 different types of alliances they talk about. They talk about either a pure alliance or competitive alliance. So I've discussed what we call a competitive alliance, which is where you would have two people at the RFP stage. They compete on the talk, and they are evaluated on talk plus technical plus people. But on a pure alliance basis, effectively after the RFQ stage, you go down to one right away, and there is no competition on price or technical solution. That has drastically fallen out of favor in New Zealand and Australia because they've convinced themselves that they were not getting good value on those pure alliance contracts. They were overpaying due to a lack of price competition. And now I'd say exclusively in New Zealand and Australia, they are using competitive alliance contracting methods. And that's, I think, the path that we will be looking to follow in British Columbia as well.
Thanks. Tara was curious about the insurance implications of the risk sharing that happens. So how would insurance arrangements work? Would they be necessary or pooled under the public sector self-insurance described by the model?
That's one we're still working through. The insurance is very different under an alliance model. And we're kind of in touch with some of the insurers in Australia that are also active in Canada as well, that are placing some of these global policies, but it is different. That's all I can say right now for that.
Okay.
Insurance is not my favorite topic. Very complicated.
I love it. All right. Stanley was wondering if the alliance contract is essentially the same as the integrity design delivery model.
I've never heard the integrity design model. Sounds similar to IPD. But I think the main difference between IPD is the fact that we would run the competitive process. And I think in IPD, the way I understand it, is more of a pure alliance type model.
Okay. Integrated, sorry, he clarified integrated. I just missed his clarification. A good question from Vladimir, which is around the contract template that might be applied under the alliance model and whether there would be the potential to use CCDC 30 when delivering alliance model projects. You may not know. Yeah.
I do have a copy of CCDC 30. I have looked at that. I think, you know, when we look at our pilot project and we have our commercial advisor and a legal advisor, I expect both of those advisors to have experience with alliance contracts in other jurisdictions, so that would be the UK, New Zealand, or Australia. I think we will have to have then a policy discussion at Partnerships BC with those advisors about different from CCDC 30. We should go with a CCDC 30 approach, or with one of these issue or precedents from the other jurisdictions. So I don't think we have a starting position, but we're not necessarily say starting with CCDC 30 and issuing that. That I'm pretty sure of. Great,
thank you. Where was it? There are a lot of questions. Bear with me as I page through them, trying to get them all done. Okay, Craig had a question on the typical length of time necessary for a project team to define and execute the project, so validate target project costs prior to detailed design and construction. Do you have any sense of that?
So I think the RFP processes that they use in New Zealand, Australia, they tend to be a little bit shorter than the RFP processes we see for the big DBFM projects in Canada. And obviously there's an evaluation stage, and then there is this bit of a validation stage with kind of some probably more auditing, I would say, in review of some of the costing than we would have in a traditional contract, because traditionally we kind of say it's your risk. We don't really get into a lot of their numbers. We just kind of look at the number and stick that in the contract and say, great, thanks, you're the winner. But since we're kind of sharing all these risks, there is greater emphasis on an examination of what those costs are, because we're going to be spending 50% of all the cost increases potentially. So I think there's a little more time in that validation phase. So I think overall, it's going to be similar to our large DBFM projects, if it's a larger project, but potentially somewhat shorter, actually.
Okay.
I think that's what they're achieving in New Zealand and Australia.
Carolina had a question around the mechanisms to monitor and evaluate contractors' progress under the Alliance model.
Did you say that one more time?
What are the mechanisms to monitor and evaluate contractors' progress in this model?
I don't think it's going to be that much different than any other contract. You're going to have a monthly progress report based on their original schedule and amount of cash that's expended. You're going to measure that against budget. And I think you're going to keep track whether you're doing kind of gain share, pain share. You're not going to true up the gain share, pain share on a monthly basis. That might be a few times during the course of the construction, depending on the length of the proposed construction period. We won't wait till the end, but it won't be on a monthly basis either.
Okay, great. Christopher had a question. You have a slide describing the payment mechanisms where you identified the owner and contractor. Is the design partner treated similarly to the contractor, i.e. losses limited to their margin?
Yes.
That's
and
an
that arrangement between design firms and the contracting firms is strictly up to them to negotiate. We have no say in that. Like, the design firm could take way more risk than the contractor if that's what they wanted. Like, I'd say that would be unlikely, but where there's no requirement for any minimum level or maximum level for either designer or contractor to take.
Great, thank you. Richard had a question. He was curious, is there a concern that this model may limit the available contractors, which could impact our competitive landscape?
I think in many ways, I think this actually opens up the field for contractors, because there are very few bonding requirements and very few financial requirements associated with signing up to the Alliance contract. So we were to do $1 billion project as a design build or design bid build, someone would need to post bonding for that amount. Given that an Alliance model is a contract target, there's no price guarantee. The levels of performance security and bonding are very low for these types of projects. So it's possible for a contractor to participate. I guess bonding and financial capacity constraints are going to be much less due to the nature of the project. It's closer to a construction management contract with incentives than it is to a design build or design bid build. So I think more people can do a construction management job than they can do a design build job, for instance. So I think it actually opens up rather than restricts the market.
That's always good for public interest.
Yeah.
Pat had a question. Trust between the Alliance members will rely upon good, true, timely information sharing. How can you achieve that information sharing contractually?
Well, it does go back to kind of it is a good faith principle at its core. There are obviously significant audit rights that the public sector component would have in order to go and investigate, and they will need to do investigations from time to time to, I guess, ensure that the reporting that they're getting is accurate. But I don't particularly see challenges on major projects right now with regards to reporting. And I appreciate we don't always get full transparency in the reporting because it's not always appropriate, because we have kind of an us and them contract. But I'm sure the contractors have that available and they are having good reporting internally. Now we're just going to say, you need to share that with us because there is no us and them, there's only us in the Alliance model. I'm not overly concerned about that.
Mindset shift.
Yes.
Okay, David has a question. Can you comment on the owner team competencies that are required to make this a success, and what you believe will be required from a leadership perspective and organizational structure to enable Alliance to be successful?
Yep, and the people part is important. So this is one of our key aspects. And, you know, we meet different contractors, or I meet different contractors in my walks of life, and I meet different public sector owner reps in my experience. And, you know, to generalize or stereotype, you have some that are kind of hard nosed. Let's make this as painful for the contractor as possible. This is what they signed up to. And you have other people which are much more, you know, oh, let's give them a break and let's kind of work it out together. The people that are kind of the hard nosed, old school contractor type, they're not going to work on a contracting model at all, an alliance model at all. It will not be successful. So part of our job is to kind of educate them on how this works. And in one of the slides that I actually had earlier with the alliance model, where I had the org chart, and I appreciate we're not there right now, and it was only on briefly. But one of the aspects there is actually an alliance coach. So it's because of the mental mind shift that's associated with the project, many of these projects have psychologists, which helps them with the teaming, and not only kind of at the beginning from a kickoff point of view, but you probably need to re-engage that person regularly when you say, you know what, we're no longer meeting the spirit or intention of what we need to do to be successful in the alliance. We need to kind of readjust or revert back to our original positive mindset. And that's what this coach is for. So I expect that at some point when we do our first pilot project, we will also have a RFQ out or RFP out for an alliance coach. So that'll be a first for us as well.
I suspect that most project teams can use that neutral person that can advise on, you know, when we're getting off track and how to stay within the spirit of the value set that are agreed between the parties. So right. I saw that and I thought that was an interesting role just to define there specifically. Our friend Jason has a question for you. Alliance and progressive DB are common in other jurisdictions, course, which you discussed, and successfully they've been applied on traditional infrastructure projects like highways and bridges. Why then is PBC looking to use the model initially on vertical or healthcare procurement? Could we perhaps use it on some horizontal infrastructure like Surrey Langley, LRT, Broadway Extension, Massey Crossing, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it could be used on some of those projects for sure. You know, I don't think it's going to be used on Surrey Langley. That's a TransLink project, so TransLink would need to determine that. It's not a provincial project. It could be used on something like Massey, but I think we have a few projects in mind for the vertical infrastructure side, which meet some of the characteristics that are associated on that slide with the 6 bullets, which could make them a good candidate for an alliance model on a vertical infrastructure side. And that's why we would be looking to pursue them. But again, I'm not in a position to identify what they are yet.
Okay. Ronald asks, and I, you know, I did notice, just for interest sake, I did notice that we have a lot of our friends from other government agencies. So, you know, they are familiar with the policies in BC and the way that we're starting to deliver projects differently. So Ronald's question was, how does the community benefits agreement fit into the alliance model? Is the community benefits coalition of BC intended to be named, or I guess that would be BCIB, intended to be a named party in a contract?
Well, I guess that's complicated because the way, you know, it is an elected official decision if community benefits agreement is going to be applied to a project. So at the moment, it's being applied to Trans-Canada Highway Corridor project, including Kicking Horse Canyon. Broadway Subway, and Pello. There haven't been any other projects that have been identified. If that were to change in the future, one could consider if and how an alliance model would fit in with community benefit agreement. I don't think there's anything that would preclude that, but I don't think we're there yet.
Not quite. Yeah. Okay. Karen has a question around how are defects and warranties dealt with under the model.
That one I will have to say I do not know the answer to that. Good question, Karen. I will have to reach out to my future legal team and commercial advisor to figure out how that works. I didn't get into those questions when I was in New Zealand and Australia. Good question.
Okay. Some of the questions, so if you bear with me, some of the questions I think we've kind of already answered through other things. So I'm just going to do a quick read through. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think. So if there's anything that I'll ask you, the last question I'll ask you is what your final thoughts are. So we'll get you prepared for that. Craig had a question around evaluation. So do you also evaluate risks documented and opportunities identified by the teams in the alliance contract model?
I think part of the risk would probably come through the technical solution. Like, so if you were building a bridge, and if you're viewed to have a very risky foundation approach, that's probably going to be affecting your technical score. Whereas if you had what was deemed to be a very robust foundation design, I think that would end up being translated into a higher score, recognizing that the risk is shared between the parties. So things like settlement risk and things like that would be shared. So I don't think it would be a kind of a separate category, but I think that risk associated with the project solution would pick up a lot of those items.
Okay. Charles has a question. Would the RFP phase look similar to a P3 procurement other than the stipend, or payment structure would be different? Or would the owner be part of each team's development of the TOC?
I think it would be similar in that, the owner will be working with both parties to help them develop their solution, but needs to respect that there's confidentiality between the two teams bidding. But I think from a bidder perspective, I think it would be largely viewed as the same, other than the stipend piece, which is referenced.
Jason has a question about subcontractors, sub-designers. So how are these parties treated in this arrangement? Are they part of the shared risk reward allocation, or are they managed via traditional subcontract arrangements?
So most of them are going to be through a traditional subcontract arrangement. The risk sharing generally only happens at the alliance contract. There are some alliance contracts that have what are called sub-alliance contracts, but I'm not sure we're necessarily pursuing that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Mike has a detailed question, sort of a scenario question, which I think will help illustrate some of the points around the alliance contract.
Yeah.
So considering the roles and responsibility slide that you had up,
yeah,
if you had a capital of say $1 billion and there's an overage of 10% or 100 million because the contractor made mistakes in costing and production on site, is the model's intent that the owner absorb 50 million or half of that, and the designer absorb a portion of that? Is that correct? So basically, you'd have this sharing base. Everybody would share, despite the fact that we know one party or the other made the mistake.
Yeah. So there's a $100 million overage, and we're sharing 50-50, which would be the plan. The private sector would need to effectively reduce their margins by 50 million margins on overhead, and the province would supply the extra 50 million in cash funding And then how that 50 million on the private sector side is allocated is an item that is dealt with on the private sector. In the previous example, I think it was 10% on that one slide. But that was just one example.
One example.
Everyone is different.
Yeah.
But yeah, the designers would be in for 10% on that one.
Okay, that's great. And similarly, if the issue was a design issue, then you'd still see the other parties having to absorb some of the.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Craig has questions just regarding the research that you did in Australia and New Zealand. So considering their experience with the model, does it incentivize innovation in processes and approaches to construction compared with other project delivery models?
I'm not sure if I specifically asked about the innovation component, but the public sector officials I spoke with were convinced that if the project were selected appropriately for Alliance, that it gave them the best possible outcome compared to other delivery models. I didn't specifically ask about whether innovation is greater or less than in these contracts opposed to other contracts.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I had it and it just went away. Where was it? Here it is. Okay, Abid asks, we've seen this shift in the last little while with large companies that used to go after P3 projects, decided to pull back due to risk factors, especially the large transit projects. Do you see the Alliance model as a possible solution to mitigate those risk factors that have caused the flight from large projects?
Yeah, that's one possibility. Another one is to do, I guess, a more customized risk sharing agreement on the crunchy risks associated with those transit projects, things like utilities and things like that, permitting.
Okay. A specific question on procurement awards. Richard asks if a typical PBC project award is based roughly 90% cost and 10% scored element factor. What is the percent cost portion used for an Alliance contract award?
Well, again, that varies by owner and project. But I definitely suspect it's less than 50% on price.
Okay, thanks. Joel asks, how does the Alliance model filter down to oh, we already did that one. Okay. Sorry. It's exactly the same question around the subcontractors and contracts. Okay. To be honest, I think most of the questions that remain have been answered through some of your other questions.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it there for now because then you're just repeating yourself. Okay. So what I'd like to ask though is if there's anything that you would like to sort of close off with, final thoughts, like what do you want us to be left with in terms of considering the Alliance model as we view procurement in British Columbia in the coming years?
Yeah, I think this is really all about a response, and I think PBC is trying to kind of help lead government's procurement, I guess, initiatives and try to respond to market conditions and concerns. In the past we did a lot of DBs and DBFM projects. But now, we're doing some CM projects now. We're doing some progressive DB projects to responding to market concerns. And based on projects that meet some of those 6 criteria, none of them need to meet all 6 of the criteria. But I think government is also open to using other forms of contract like Alliance. We have a big pipeline of projects which we need to deliver. We need to probably pick the right delivery model for the right projects and have more variety than we've probably seen in the past. And I think as we continue to do this, our first plan as per this RFP, which is out on BC Bid, is to really help develop some of the details of the framework in terms of the commercial and legal framework to move forward. And then we probably need to have more engagement with the market before it's released, because this will only be successful if people understand it and agree to participate in the alliance model. It's not enough for us just to stick out a fully formed contract and say, yeah, go bid on it. It's probably not going to be successful. So it's important that we have opportunities like this to engage with your members and other people in the industry and hear what kind of those questions are. And maybe at some point in the future, I'll come back with maybe a more detailed framework and provide more details and hopefully be able to answer more of these questions. Some of them, unfortunately, I couldn't answer, like the insurance question and the warranty question. Those are good questions, but I haven't got to that level of detail, though I do know insurance is very different. I have had some reading on it already. I'm just not the best insurance expert, but I can improve and maybe come back and be able to answer some more questions at a later date.
Well, the advantage of of having a team approach to these sorts of things is that we can always invite in somebody from the insurance side of the business, a broker or an underwriter who has more familiarity and can answer those detailed questions. Because I can tell you, I did skip a couple of other insurance-related questions as well.
Insurance is important.
It's the same problem when people ask detailed legal questions. We don't expect everyone to be a lawyer. So.
No.
So thank you very much, Mark. That was very informative, great introduction, and clearly there's a lot of interest in understanding this model, so we really appreciate you taking the time today, and you are welcome to come back anytime and speak to us further about any of PBC's projects. I'm going to thank everyone for joining us today and for your questions. Following the close of our meeting, a copy of the webinar will be emailed to you. Remember to stay up to date on industry news, resources, and future webinars by visiting ACEC-BC.ca. That concludes today's session. We look forward to your participation in upcoming webinar.